They say money can't buy happiness, but let me tell you something, it can sure as hell buy revenge. And sometimes that's exactly what you need to feel whole again. I'm sitting here in my new apartment, looking out at a view that would have been impossible for me to afford just 6 months ago. The irony isn't lost on me. 6 months ago, I thought I was broke. Completely, utterly broke. My husband had made sure of that. But life has a funny way of evening the score, and sometimes the universe hands you exactly what you need at exactly the right moment. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I discovered that the man I'd loved for 8 years had been systematically destroying our life behind my back, and how I used a stroke of impossible luck to destroy his right back. It started on a Tuesday. I remember that detail so clearly because Tuesdays were always our grocery shopping days. Such a mundane, ordinary detail for the day my entire world crumbled. I was rushing around our small kitchen, making a list of what we needed, mentally calculating costs the way I'd learned to do over the past few months. Money had been tighter lately, or so I thought. "David, honey, do you have the grocery money?" I called out to the living room where my husband was lounging on our second-hand couch, scrolling through his phone as usual. Yeah, just give me a minute," he mumbled back, not even looking up from his screen. I waited and waited. The familiar knot of anxiety that had become my constant companion over the past year tightened in my stomach. "David?" I said, "Give me a minute." His voice had that sharp edge it got when he was stressed about money, which lately seemed to be all the time. I walked into the living room, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet. "What's wrong? Is everything okay with the bank account?" The look that flashed across his face should have been my first real clue. It was there and gone so fast I almost missed it. Panic, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe. "Everything's fine, Sarah." "Jesus, you worry too much." He forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to my ears. "I'll transfer some money to your account in a few minutes, okay? I'm just dealing with some work stuff." Work stuff. That was his catch-all excuse for everything lately. Work stress. Work problems. Work, work, work. But I'd learned not to push. David had been so sensitive about money discussions recently, and the last thing I wanted was another fight. "Okay," I said softly, hating how small my voice sounded. "I'll just wait a bit before heading to the store." I retreated to the kitchen and tried to distract myself by reorganizing our already perfectly organized cupboards. 20 minutes passed, then 30. My phone remained silent, no notification of any money transfer. "David?" I called again, my voice echoing off the kitchen tiles. Silence. I walked back to the living room, but he wasn't there. The front door was closed, his keys were gone from the hook, and his phone was nowhere to be seen. He'd left. Without a word, without the grocery money, without any explanation. The anxiety in my stomach had transformed into something sharper, more urgent. I grabbed my laptop from the kitchen counter and logged into our shared bank account, something I'd been doing less and less lately because David had taken over managing the finances about 6 months ago. My hands were shaking as I typed in our login information. The page loaded, and I stared at the screen for a full 30 seconds before my brain could process what I was seeing. $247.83. That was it. That was all that was left in our checking account. The account that should have had at least $3,000 in it. The account that held my paychecks from my job at the local marketing firm, David's supposed paychecks from his job at the telecommunications company, and what remained of our carefully hoarded savings. $247.83. My chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing my lungs in a vice. I clicked through to our savings account, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind reeled. $0.00. Zero. Our savings account, the one we'd been building for 5 years, the one that had contained nearly $15,000 the last time I'd checked 3 months ago, was completely empty. I sat there staring at that goose egg on the screen, and I felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart exactly, though that was definitely cracking too. It was more like the sound of trust shattering, the foundation of my life crumbling beneath my feet. Where was our money? Where were David's paychecks? Where were my paychecks from the last 3 months? With trembling fingers, I clicked through the transaction history. What I found there made me physically nauseous. Cash withdrawals, hundreds of them. Some for $50, some for $100, some for as much as $500 at a time. All made by David, all over the past 6 months. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. ATM locations I didn't recognize, businesses I'd never heard of. And then, buried in the middle of dozens of cash withdrawals, a payment that made everything click into place. Riverside Casino, $800. Lucky Sevens Gaming, $1,200. Golden Horseshoe Casino, $650. Jackpot Junction, $2,000. The list went on and on and on. Months of gambling transactions, each one a nail in the coffin of our financial stability, our future, our marriage. David hadn't been managing our finances. He'd been systematically draining them to feed a gambling addiction I'd never even suspected existed. I closed the laptop and ran to the bathroom, where I barely made it to the toilet before I threw up everything I'd eaten that morning. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating that my body couldn't handle it. Every cash withdrawal felt like a physical blow. Every casino payment felt like a slap across my face. When there was nothing left to vomit, I sat on the cold bathroom tiles and cried. Not the pretty, delicate tears you see in movies, but ugly, body-racking sobs that tore from somewhere deep in my chest. The kind of crying that leaves you exhausted and hollow. How had I not known? How had I been so blind, so trusting, so stupid? All those nights he'd come home late, claiming he'd been working overtime. All those weekends he'd disappeared for hours, saying he was helping a friend move or dealing with family stuff. All those times he'd been irritable and distant, which I'd attributed to work stress. He'd been gambling away our future, our security, our dreams. The house we'd been saving for, the vacation we'd planned for our anniversary, the emergency fund that was supposed to keep us safe, all of it gone, fed into slot machines and poker tables and whatever other demons had been eating away at my husband's soul. I don't know how long I sat on that bathroom floor, but eventually the tears stopped and something else took their place. Something cold and hard and sharp. Anger. How dare he? How dare he destroy our life without even giving me the courtesy of a conversation? How dare he look me in the eye every morning and lie about where our money was going? How dare he make me feel guilty for asking about grocery money when he'd been spending hundreds of dollars at casinos? I stood up on shaky legs and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. My eyes were red and swollen, my face blotchy and raw. I looked like a woman whose life had just fallen apart. Which, I supposed, was exactly what I was. But as I stared at my reflection, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be a victim. I wasn't going to be the pathetic wife who discovered her husband's addiction and just took it. David had made his choice when he decided to gamble away our money without telling me. Now I was going to make mine. I splashed cold water on my face, pulled my hair back into a ponytail, and walked back to the kitchen. I had planning to do. The first thing I did was open a new bank account at a different bank. I transferred what little remained in our shared account. My money, I told myself, earned from my job that I'd been working while David was out destroying our future. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The second thing I did was call my boss and ask if I could pick up extra hours. Linda, my supervisor at the marketing firm, was sympathetic when I explained that I was going through some financial difficulties, without going into detail about David's gambling. "Of course, honey," she said, her voice warm with concern. "We've got that big campaign for the Henderson Group coming up, and I could really use someone to work on the weekend research. Would you be interested?" "Yes," I said immediately. "Absolutely yes." The third thing I did was start documenting everything. I printed out every bank statement, every transaction record, every piece of evidence of David's gambling addiction. I organized it all in a folder and tucked it away in my closet, hidden behind my winter clothes where I knew he'd never look. The fourth thing I did was contact a divorce lawyer. "I need a consultation," I told the receptionist at Morrison & Associates, a law firm I'd found through a quick Google search. "My husband has been gambling away our marital assets without my knowledge." "I'm sorry to hear that," the woman said, her voice professionally sympathetic. "We can schedule you for next Wednesday at 2 o'clock with Mr. Morrison himself." "Perfect," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'll be there." David came home around 8 that night, reeking of cigarettes and wearing the same guilty expression I now recognized from every other time he'd been gambling. He'd probably lost even more money, I realized. Money we didn't have. "Hey, babe," he said, trying to sound casual as he hung his keys on the hook. "Sorry about earlier. Work was crazy today." I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, pretending to work on a client presentation. I said without looking up. Did you make it to the grocery store?" Now I did look up, and I saw him flinch slightly at whatever he saw in my eyes. "No, David, I didn't make it to the grocery store. Funny thing about that, it's hard to buy groceries when you don't have any money." He shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting with his car keys. "What do you mean? I told you I'd transfer some money. Did you?" I kept my voice level, controlled, because I've been checking my account all day and I haven't seen any transfers. In fact, I haven't seen much of anything in our accounts lately. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. Sarah, I can explain. Can you? I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. Because I'd love to hear an explanation for how our savings account went from $15,000 to zero in less than 6 months. I'd love to hear an explanation for all those casino withdrawals. I'd really love to hear an explanation for how you thought you could gamble away our entire future without me finding out. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, his face in his hands. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy, the old urge to comfort him when he was clearly in pain. But then I remembered the $0 in our savings account, and that feeling died a quick death. I'm sick, Sarah, he said finally, his voice muffled by his hands. I have a problem, a gambling problem. I know that now. You know that now? My voice was getting sharper despite my efforts to stay calm. You didn't know that when you spent our entire emergency fund? You didn't know that when you gambled away the money for our mortgage down payment? You didn't know that when you stole my paychecks? I never meant for it to get this bad, he said, finally looking up at me. His eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. It started small, just $20 or $30 here and there when I was stressed about work. But then I started winning sometimes, and I thought maybe I could win back what I'd lost. Make it all better before you ever found out. How much, David? I asked quietly. What? How much did you lose? Total. He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. About $23,000. $23,000? Our entire savings, plus money from our checking account, plus what must have been credit cards or loans I didn't even know about. $23,000 fed into gambling machines and poker tables while I worried about spending $30 on groceries. I stood up from the table and David reached out toward me. Sarah, please. I'll get help. I'll go to meetings. I'll never gamble again, I swear to you. I stepped back from his reaching hand. Where are you going to get the money for meetings, David? Where are you going to get the money for anything? We're broke. Completely broke. Because of you. I'll figure it out, he said desperately. I'll get a second job. I'll sell my car. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I looked at this man I'd been married to for 8 years, this man I'd trusted with my heart and my future and my financial security, and I felt absolutely nothing. No love, no anger, no sadness, just a cold, empty numbness where my feelings for him used to be. I'm going to my sister's house, I said calmly. I need some time to think. Sarah, please don't leave. We can work through this together. I paused at the kitchen doorway and looked back at him. He was still sitting at our table, looking broken and pathetic in his wrinkled work clothes. 6 months ago, I would have felt sorry for him. Now all I felt was contempt. Together? I said. David, there is no together anymore. You made sure of that when you decided to gamble away our marriage. I drove to my sister Kate's house in a daze, my hands steady on the wheel even though my mind was reeling. Kate took one look at my face when she opened the door and immediately ushered me inside without asking any questions. Wine or coffee? She asked, leading me to her living room. Wine, I said. Definitely wine. She poured 2 generous glasses of red wine and sat down next to me on her couch. Okay. What did that bastard do now? Kate had never liked David. She'd always said there was something off about him, something that didn't quite ring true. I'd defended him for years, insisting that she just didn't know him like I did. Tonight I realized she'd been right all along. I told her everything. The empty bank accounts, the casino transactions, the $23,000 David had gambled away without my knowledge. Kate listened without interrupting, her face growing darker with each detail. That son of a bitch, she said when I finished. Sarah, I am so sorry. But you know what you have to do, right? Divorce him, I said. It wasn't a question. Damn right, divorce him. And take him for everything he's worth, which granted isn't much at this point, but still. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. There's nothing to take, Kate. He spent it all. Then you start over, she said firmly. You're young, you're smart, you have a good job. You'll rebuild. I nodded, but inside I was calculating the reality of starting over at 31 with essentially nothing. No savings, no house down payment, no emergency fund. Just my salary from the marketing firm and whatever I could scrape together working extra hours. It felt impossible. Overwhelming, like climbing a mountain with my bare hands. But what choice did I have? I stayed at Kate's that night, and the next night, and the night after that. David called approximately 50 times the first day, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that I didn't bother listening to. By the third day, the calls had stopped. On Thursday, I met with Mr. Morrison, the divorce lawyer. He was a kind man in his 60s who specialized in cases involving financial deception and fraud. The good news, he told me after reviewing my documentation, is that you have a very clear case for divorce based on financial misconduct. The bad news is that there aren't any assets left to divide. What about his retirement account? His 401k? Mr. Morrison's expression was grim. We can certainly investigate, but given the extent of his gambling, it's possible those accounts have been compromised as well. Many gambling addicts will liquidate everything they can access when they're in deep. My heart sank even further. I'd been holding on to a small hope that maybe David's retirement account was intact, that there might be something left to help me restart my life. However, Mr. Morrison continued, if we can prove that the gambling constituted financial abuse and deception, we might be able to pursue other remedies. And if he's taken on debt to fund his gambling, credit cards, loans, etc., we can work to ensure that debt doesn't become your responsibility. It was something, at least. A small protection against David's addiction, destroying what little remained of my future. I signed the retainer agreement and walked out of Mr. Morrison's office feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. I was really doing this. I was really getting divorced, really starting over, really throwing away 8 years of marriage to escape the wreckage David had created. That weekend, I worked at the marketing firm, diving into research for the Henderson Group campaign with the intensity that surprised even me. It felt good to focus on something concrete, something I could control and excel at. Linda was impressed with my work and mentioned that there might be opportunities for advancement if I kept up this level of dedication. You seem different lately, she said as we wrapped up on Sunday afternoon. More focused, more driven. I'm going through some changes in my personal life, I said carefully. I'm trying to channel that energy into my work. She nodded knowingly. Well, whatever's happening, it's working. Your campaign ideas for Henderson are brilliant. I left the office that evening feeling something I hadn't felt in months, proud of myself, competent, like maybe I really could rebuild my life from scratch. But I was still broke, still sleeping on my sister's couch, still facing the reality that I was starting over with essentially nothing, while my soon-to-be ex-husband had left me holding the bag for his addiction. That's when the universe decided to play its most cosmic joke yet. It was the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after I'd discovered David's gambling addiction, when I stopped at the corner gas station near Kate's house to buy a coffee before work. I was mentally calculating whether I could afford the extra 50 cents for a larger size when I noticed the Powerball sign announcing that the jackpot had reached $87 million. I'd never been much of a lottery player. David and I had always been too practical for that kind of waste of money. We saved our dollars for sensible things like emergency funds and retirement accounts, or at least I thought we had. But standing there in that gas station, broke and desperate and facing an uncertain future, I felt a wild impulse. What did I have to lose? $5? I'd already lost $23,000. And a lottery ticket? I told the cashier, handing over the extra money. Quick pick. The ticket was small and flimsy in my hand, the numbers printed in tiny black text, 07-14-21-28-35, Powerball 18. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my wallet, then forgot about it completely. The drawing was on Wednesday night. I was at Kate's house working on my laptop while she watched some reality TV show when I remembered the ticket. I dug it out of my wallet more out of curiosity than hope and pulled up the lottery website on my phone. The winning numbers appeared on my screen. 07, 14, 21, 28, 35, Powerball 18. I stared at my phone for a full minute, certain I was misreading something. Then I looked at my ticket, then back at my phone, then at my ticket again. Kate, I said, my voice coming out as a croak. She didn't look away from her show. Kate, I think I need you to look at something. Something in my voice must have gotten through to her because she muted the TV and turned to face me. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. I handed her my phone and my lottery ticket. Do these numbers match? Kate looked at the phone, then at the ticket, then at the phone again. Her face went completely white. Sarah, she whispered, these numbers match exactly. That's what I thought, but I wanted to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. You won, she said, her voice getting louder. Holy shit, Sarah, you won the lottery. And just like that, everything changed. Again. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic Google searches, phone calls to the lottery office, and Kate periodically shrieking with excitement. The jackpot was $87 million, which would come out to approximately $54 million after taxes if I took the lump sum payment. $54 million. I'd gone from broke to multimillionaire in the span of a week. From having my future destroyed by my husband's gambling addiction to having more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. The irony was so sharp it was almost funny. Almost. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on Kate's couch, staring at the ceiling, the lottery ticket burning a hole in my purse across the room. My mind was racing through possibilities, calculations, plans. What would I do with that kind of money? How would it change my life? How would it change me? And then, around 3 a.m, a different kind of thought crept in. A darker thought. A thought that made me smile for the first time since discovering David's betrayal. David didn't know about the lottery ticket. He had no idea that his broke, devastated wife had just won more money than he could gamble away in 10 lifetimes. He was probably at home right now, wallowing in guilt and desperation, figuring out how to beg me to come back and work together to rebuild what he'd destroyed. But I didn't need to rebuild anymore. I didn't need him anymore. I didn't need to forgive him or work through his addiction or sacrifice my future to fix his mistakes. I had options now. I had power. And I was going to use both to make sure David learned exactly what it felt like to lose everything. The plan started forming slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. I couldn't just disappear immediately. That would be suspicious. I needed to play this smart, strategically. I needed to make sure David never suspected that I'd won the lottery until it was too late for him to claim any part of it. The first step was claiming the prize without David finding out. I took a personal day from work and drove 2 hours to the state lottery headquarters, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap like some kind of amateur spy. The lottery officials were congratulations and professional, walking me through the paperwork and tax implications. Most winners choose to remain anonymous if possible, the representative told me. We can arrange for the payout to go to a trust or LLC to protect your privacy. Yes, I said immediately. I want to remain completely anonymous. I set up an LLC called Summit Holdings, a bland, generic name that could have been anything, and arranged for all lottery communications to go to a P.O. box I'd rented under the business name. David would never see any mail or documentation about the winnings. The money would be transferred to a new bank account I'd opened specifically for this purpose at a bank in another state. Even if David somehow gained access to my local banking information, he'd never find the lottery account. I was covering my tracks like a criminal, and I felt absolutely no guilt about it. Because here's the thing, David had spent 8 years lying to me about money. 8 years of managing our finances, while secretly feeding his addiction. 8 years of looking me in the eye and pretending we were building a future together, while he systematically destroyed it behind my back. Now it was my turn to have secrets. Now it was my turn to control the money. Now it was my turn to make plans without consulting him. The lottery money would take about 2 weeks to process and transfer, 2 weeks during which I needed to continue playing the part of the broke, betrayed wife. 2 weeks to plan exactly how I was going to use my newfound wealth to ensure David got exactly what he deserved. I went back to staying at Kate's house, working extra hours at the marketing firm, and meeting with my divorce lawyer. To everyone around me, I was the picture of a woman trying to rebuild her life after financial devastation. Only I knew that I was actually planning the most elegant revenge in the history of marriage. David continued calling and texting, his messages growing more desperate as the days passed. He'd apparently sold his car, probably to pay off some gambling debt, and was taking the bus to work. He'd moved out of our apartment because we couldn't afford the rent and was staying with his friend Mike. "Please, Sarah," read one of his texts. "I know I messed up, but I'm getting help. I joined Gamblers Anonymous and I haven't placed a bet in over a week. I can change. We can get through this together." I deleted the message without responding. Let him think I was too hurt and angry to talk to him. Let him think he'd destroyed our marriage beyond repair. Let him believe he'd lost everything. Because he had, he just didn't know it yet. While David was attending his support group meetings and presumably learning about the devastating effects of gambling addiction on families, I was using my evenings to research investment strategies for sudden wealth. I read articles about lottery winners who'd lost everything within 5 years and swore I wouldn't be one of them. I researched financial advisors, accountants, and investment firms. I was going to be smart with this money. I was going to make it last. And I was going to use it to build the life I'd always wanted, the life David's addiction had stolen from me. But first, I was going to use it to make sure he understood exactly what he'd thrown away. The money transferred on a Thursday, $54,312,897.63 appeared in my Summit Holdings account like a miracle, like a dream, like the most beautiful numbers I'd ever seen. I was a multimillionaire. I was financially set for life. I could buy a house, travel the world, start a business, or just live comfortably forever without ever working again. But first, I had a marriage to end and a husband to educate about consequences. I started small. I went to the local BMW dealership and paid cash for a brand new X5. Not too flashy, but definitely nicer than the 10-year-old Honda I'd been driving. When the salesman asked about financing, I opened my purse and pulled out a cashier's check for the full amount. "Will this work?" I asked innocently. His eyes nearly popped out of his head. "Yes, ma'am, this will definitely work." I drove my new BMW to the apartment David and I had shared, where he was apparently still living despite not being able to afford the rent. His beat-up Honda was in the parking lot, and I felt a little thrill of satisfaction knowing he'd probably been taking the bus to work while trying to figure out how to replace the car he'd sold. I used my key to let myself in. The apartment looked exactly the same except for the pile of overdue bills on the kitchen counter and the general air of depression that seemed to hang over everything. David was sitting on the couch in the same spot where I'd found him the day I discovered his gambling addiction. He looked up when I entered, and his face went through several emotions in rapid succession: hope, confusion, and then something approaching fear. "Sarah," he said, standing up quickly, "you came home." "I'm not home, David. I'm here to get my things." He looked past me toward the front door, and I saw the exact moment he spotted my new car through the window. His face went completely blank. Is that a new BMW?" he asked slowly. "Yes, it is." Where did you get the money for a new BMW?" I smiled at him, and I could see from his expression that it wasn't a particularly warm smile. "I've been working a lot of extra hours lately, picking up new clients. Turns out I'm pretty good at making money when I put my mind to it." It wasn't technically a lie. I had been working extra hours. I just hadn't bought the car with that money. "Sarah, that car costs more than we made in 6 months. There's no way you could afford..." "Could afford what, David?" I interrupted. "Could afford to make financial decisions without consulting you? Could afford to spend money without your permission? Could afford to buy something nice for myself instead of watching you gamble it away?" He sat back down heavily, his hands running through his hair. "That's not what I meant. Isn't it?" I walked to our bedroom and started packing my clothes into the suitcases I'd brought, because it seems to me like you're awfully concerned about how I'm spending my money when you never bothered to consult me about how you were spending ours. He followed me to the bedroom doorway but didn't come in. "I deserve that. I know I screwed up, Sarah. I know I hurt you. But we can work through this. I'm getting help. I'm going to meetings." "With what money?" I asked, folding my work blouses into the suitcase. "How are you paying for gas to get to these meetings? How are you paying the rent on this apartment? How are you paying for anything?" The silence that followed was long and telling. "I borrowed some money from Mike," he said finally. "You borrowed money from Mike?" I turned to face him. "So now you're not just a gambling addict, you're also mooching off your friends." "It's temporary," he said defensively. "Just until I get back on my feet." "Back on your feet with what job, David?" "Because last I checked, you still owe $23,000 to casinos and credit card companies. Last I checked, you don't have any money, any savings, or any way to pay back what you've already stolen." Each word was carefully chosen, precisely aimed to hit exactly where it would hurt most. I watched him flinch with every sentence, and I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no sympathy, no regret. This man had looked me in the eye for months while systematically destroying our financial future. He'd lied to me about where our money was going, made me feel guilty for spending $30 on groceries, and gambled away 8 years of careful saving without a single conversation about his addiction. Now it was his turn to feel powerless, his turn to face the consequences of his choices. I finished packing and wheeled my suitcases to the front door. David trailed behind me like a lost puppy, still trying to convince me to give him another chance. "Sarah, please. I know you're angry and you have every right to be. But I love you. I want to fix this. I want to fix us." I paused at the door and looked back at him one last time. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what he'd done and what he'd lost. 6 months ago, I would have felt sorry for him. Now all I felt was a cold satisfaction. "You can't fix this, David," I said quietly. "You can't fix us. Because there is no us anymore. You gambled that away along with everything else." I walked out the door and didn't look back. That night, I had dinner at the most expensive restaurant in town. I ordered the lobster and the bottle of wine that cost more than David's gambling addiction support group meetings. I raised a toast to myself in the elegant dining room, surrounded by couples who had no idea they were sitting next to a lottery winner. To new beginnings, I whispered to my reflection in the wine glass. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. The divorce proceedings moved forward quickly, helped by David's obvious guilt and the clear evidence of his financial misconduct. Mr. Morrison was efficient and thorough, ensuring that David's gambling debts would be his responsibility alone and that I would be free to start fresh without any of his addiction-related financial baggage. He's agreed to all our terms. Mr. Morrison told me during one of our meetings. No alimony, clean break, he assumes all debt related to his gambling. Frankly, I think he's so guilt-ridden he'd agree to anything. Perfect. That's exactly what I'd been counting on. During this time, I continued my performance as the struggling, rebuilding divorcee. I kept working at the marketing firm, kept living modestly, kept driving my BMW but explaining it away as a necessary professional investment paid for with my extra freelance work. Kate was the only person who knew about the lottery win, and I swore her to secrecy until the divorce was finalized. "I still can't believe you're not telling him," she said one evening as we shared a bottle of wine on her back porch. "I mean, the look on his face when he finds out would be priceless." "Oh, he's going to find out," I said, smiling. "Just not until it's too late for him to do anything about it." "What do you mean?" I took a sip of wine and watched the sunset over Kate's backyard. "I mean, I'm going to wait until our divorce is completely final, until he's signed away any claim to any assets I might acquire, and then I'm going to make sure he knows exactly what kind of life he could have had if he hadn't been a lying, gambling addict." Kate stared at me for a moment, then started laughing. "Sarah, that's absolutely diabolical." "Is it?" I asked. "Because I think it's justice." The divorce was finalized on a Friday in November, exactly 3 months after I'd discovered David's gambling addiction and 2 months after I'd won the lottery. I signed the papers in Mr. Morrison's office with a feeling of profound relief and satisfaction. I was free. Legally, financially, emotionally free from David and his addiction and the wreckage he'd made of our life together. And now it was time for the final act of my revenge. I drove straight from the lawyer's office to the most exclusive real estate agent in town. Margaret Whitmore handled only the most expensive properties in our area, the kind of houses I would never have been able to afford on my marketing salary, the kind of houses David and I used to drive by and joke about living in someday. "I'm interested in looking at houses," I told Margaret when I walked into her office. "Something in the 2 to 3 million range." Margaret's perfectly made-up face showed just a flicker of surprise before smoothing back into professional politeness. I was dressed in my usual work clothes. Nice, but not looking at $3 million houses. Nice. "Of course," she said. "Do you have financing pre-approval, or would you like me to recommend some excellent mortgage brokers?" "I'll be paying cash," I said simply. Now I had her full attention. We spent the afternoon looking at houses that were so far beyond what I'd ever imagined for myself that it felt like touring movie sets. Sprawling estates with pools and guest houses and views that stretched for miles. Modern mansions with smart home technology and wine cellars and master suites larger than the apartment David and I had shared. The third house we visited was perfect. A stunning contemporary home on 5 acres, with floor-to-ceiling windows, a gourmet kitchen that belonged in a magazine, and a home office that overlooked a private lake. It was beautiful, it was peaceful, and it was exactly the kind of place where I could build my new life. "I'll take it," I told Margaret as we stood on the deck watching the sunset reflect off the lake. "Don't you want to think about it? See a few more properties? Have an inspection?" "I've thought about it," I said. "I want this one." The paperwork was handled quickly when you're paying cash. No mortgage approval, no financing contingencies, no waiting for bank underwriters. Just a cashier's check for $2.8 million and the keys to my new home. I moved in the following weekend, hiring a moving company to transport the few belongings I'd taken from the apartment David and I had shared. Everything else, the furniture we'd bought together, the wedding gifts, the remnants of our shared life, I left for him to deal with. My new house was mostly empty, furnished only with a mattress on the floor of the master bedroom and a single chair on the deck overlooking the lake. but it was mine. Completely, totally mine. Bought with my money, in my name only, a monument to the life I was building without David. That first night in my new house, I sat on the deck with a glass of wine and thought about what I wanted to do next. I had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. I had complete freedom to go anywhere, do anything, become anyone I wanted to be. But first, I had one more thing to do. One final message to send to the man who'd betrayed me so completely. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found David's number. I hadn't spoken to him since the day I'd picked up my belongings from our apartment, but I knew from mutual friends that he was still struggling. Still living with his friend Mike, still taking the bus to work, still trying to figure out how to dig himself out of the financial hole he'd created. I typed out a text message, deleted it, typed another one, deleted that too. Finally, I settled on something simple and direct. David, I wanted you to know that our divorce was finalized today. I also wanted you to know that I bought a house. You should drive by 1247 Lakeshore Drive and see what your gambling addiction cost you. What it cost us. Thanks for teaching me that I don't need anyone else to build the life I want. Sarah. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. My phone rang almost immediately. David's name on the screen, calling me for the first time since I'd left him. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message with a small smile on my face. Sarah, what the hell? What do you mean you bought a house? How could you possibly afford... Jesus Christ, I just looked up that address. That house is worth almost $3 million. How is this possible? Please call me back. We need to talk. I deleted the voicemail and poured myself another glass of wine. He called 6 more times that night. I didn't answer any of them. The next morning, I was having coffee on my deck when I saw a familiar beat-up Honda slowly driving down my street. David had come to see for himself, just as I'd known he would. I watched from my deck as his car stopped in front of my gate. Through the tall trees that bordered my property, I could just make out his silhouette sitting in the driver's seat, staring up at the house that could have been ours if he hadn't thrown it all away. He sat there for almost an hour, just sitting, staring, processing the reality of what he was seeing. His ex-wife, the woman he'd left broke and devastated just 3 months ago, living in a mansion that cost more than he would make in 50 years. Finally, his car pulled away. But I knew he'd be back. I was right. Over the next few days, David drove by my house multiple times. He called, he texted, he even showed up at my office at the marketing firm, demanding to know how I could afford such an expensive house. I've been working extra hours, I told him calmly when he cornered me in the parking lot after work. I told you I'm good at making money when I put my mind to it. Sarah, that's bullshit and you know it, he said, his voice desperate and confused. Nobody makes enough money in 3 months to buy a $3 million house. Did you inherit money? Did someone die? I looked at this man who'd shared my bed for 8 years, who'd promised to love and honor me, who'd systematically lied to me about the most fundamental aspect of our partnership, and I felt nothing but contempt. Why do you care, David? I asked. We're divorced. My finances are none of your business anymore. Because I need to understand what happened. How did you go from broke to living in a mansion in 3 months? The same way you went from having a savings account to being broke in 6 months, I said coolly. Choices. I got in my BMW and drove away, leaving him standing in the parking lot with his mouth hanging open. That weekend, I decided it was time to fully embrace my new life. I hired an interior designer to furnish my house, bought a wardrobe that actually reflected my new financial status, and made an appointment with a financial advisor to discuss long-term investment strategies. I also did something I'd been dreaming about since I was a teenager. I bought a horse. Riding lessons had been one of those things David and I could never afford. Maybe someday, we'd always said. When we have more money, when we're more established. Well, now I was established. Now I had more money than I knew what to do with, and I wanted a horse. I found a beautiful thoroughbred mare named Luna at a stable about 30 minutes from my house. She was gentle and intelligent and absolutely perfect. I bought her, paid for a year of boarding and training, and arranged for private riding lessons twice a week. It was while I was at the stable for my 3rd lesson that David found me again. I was brushing Luna after our ride when I heard a car pull up in the gravel parking area. I looked up to see David's Honda, and my stomach tightened with annoyance. How had he even found me here? Sarah, he called out as he walked toward the stable. We need to talk. Several other riders and stable workers turned to look at the commotion, and I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. This was exactly the kind of scene I'd been trying to avoid. David, you need to leave. I said firmly, continuing to brush Luna's coat. This is harassment. This is my wife trying to figure out what the hell is going on, he shot back. Ex-wife, I corrected. And what's going on is that I'm living my life without you. He looked around the stable, taking in the expensive horses, the well-maintained facilities, the obvious wealth of the other riders. How are you paying for this, Sarah? How are you paying for any of this? I set down the brush and turned to face him fully. Luna nickered softly behind me, as if sensing the tension. I won the lottery, David. The words came out before I could stop them, sharp and clear in the afternoon air. David stared at me like I'd just told him I was an alien from Mars. You what? I won the lottery, I repeated, louder this time. $54 million after taxes. I bought the ticket the week after I found out about your gambling addiction. The color drained from his face so completely I thought he might collapse. You're lying. Am I? I pulled out my phone and showed him a screenshot of my bank balance. Not the full amount, just one of my investment accounts with a casual 7-figure balance. Does this look like I'm lying? He stared at the screen for a long moment, then looked up at my face, then back at the screen. $54 million. $54 million. When? The ticket was purchased on Tuesday, September 15th. The drawing was Wednesday, September 16th. The money was transferred to my account on October 2nd. Our divorce was finalized on November 20th. I watched him do the math, watched the realization dawn on his face that I'd known about the money for the entire duration of our divorce proceedings and had never said a word. You knew, he whispered. During all those meetings with the lawyers, during all those conversations about starting over, during all those times I begged you to give me another chance, you knew you were a multimillionaire. I knew, and you didn't tell me. Why would I tell you? I asked, my voice cold as winter. So you could gamble that away too? He stumbled backward like I'd physically struck him. Sarah, that money, if you'd won that while we were still married. But I didn't win it while we were married, did I, David? I won it after you'd already destroyed our marriage, after you'd already gambled away every penny we had, after you'd already proven that you couldn't be trusted with money. But we were still legally married when you bought the ticket. Were we? I interrupted. Because it seems to me like our marriage ended the day you decided to start lying to me about money. It seems to me like our marriage ended the day you chose gambling over our future. The divorce papers were just a formality. He was shaking now, his hands trembling as the full magnitude of what he'd lost really hit him. Not just our marriage, not just our savings, but $54 million. A lifetime of financial security, of luxury, of never having to worry about money again. Sarah, please, he said, his voice breaking. I'm sick. I have an addiction. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. And I didn't mean to win the lottery, I said. But I did. And you didn't. And that's the difference between making good choices and making bad ones. I turned back to Luna and continued brushing her coat, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Behind me, I could hear David breathing heavily, probably having some kind of panic attack as he processed the reality of what his gambling addiction had cost him. I could have shared that money with you, I said without turning around. If you'd been honest with me from the beginning, if you'd come to me when the gambling first became a problem and asked for help, if you'd treated me like a partner instead of a mark. Sarah, but you didn't, I continued. You chose to lie. You chose to steal. You chose to gamble away our entire future without giving me a voice in that decision. So now you get to live with the consequences of those choices. I'll contest the divorce, he said desperately. I'll sue you. That money should be half mine. Now I did turn around and I smiled at him. It wasn't a nice smile. Go ahead, I said. Call a lawyer. Explain to them how you think you deserve half of a lottery ticket your ex-wife bought after you'd already gambled away $23,000 of marital assets. Explain to them how you think someone who systematically lied about finances for months deserves access to more money. His face was pale and sweaty, his breathing still labored. Sarah, I'm begging you. Have some compassion. I'm broke. I'm living with a friend. I take the bus to work. I can't even afford to replace the car I had to sell to pay off gambling debts. And whose fault is that, David? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Several other people at the stable had stopped what they were doing to watch our confrontation, probably wondering if they should call security. You could help me, he said finally. You could give me enough to get back on my feet. Start over. Start over with what? I asked. Another gambling addiction? Another series of lies? Another betrayal? I'm getting help. I haven't gambled in 2 months. 2 months, I repeated. 2 whole months. And you think that proves you're cured? I think it proves I'm trying. I finished brushing Luna and led her back to her stall. David followed me like a lost dog, still pleading his case. David, I said finally, latching Luna's stall door. I want you to think about something. I want you to think about every lie you told me over the past year. Every time you looked me in the eye and pretended our money was going to bills and savings when you were actually feeding it into slot machines. Every time you made me feel guilty for spending money on groceries while you were spending hundreds of dollars at casinos. He was quiet, staring at the ground. I want you to think about how it felt when I found out. How it felt to discover that the person I trusted most in the world had been systematically betraying that trust for months. How it felt to realize that our entire financial future had been destroyed by your addiction. I know I hurt you. Do you? I interrupted. Do you really? Because it seems to me like you're more upset about missing out on lottery money than you are about the pain you caused me. That shut him up. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. You're going to leave me alone. You're not going to call. You're not going to text. You're not going to show up at my house or my work or my stable. You're going to accept that our marriage is over, that I owe you nothing, and that you're going to have to live with the consequences of your choices. And if I don't, then I'll get a restraining order. And I'll make sure everyone we know understands exactly why our marriage ended and exactly how much your gambling addiction cost both of us. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. I loved you, he said quietly. No, I replied. You loved the idea of me. You loved having someone to lie to, someone to hide your addiction from, someone to clean up your mess when it all fell apart. If you'd actually loved me, you would have been honest with me. He turned and walked back to his car without another word. I watched him drive away, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the day I'd discovered his gambling addiction. Peace. It was over. Really, truly over. David was out of my life. I was free to build whatever future I wanted, and I had the resources to make that future extraordinary. That evening, I sat on my deck with a glass of wine and called Kate to tell her what had happened. You told him? She said, her voice a mixture of shock and delight. Oh my God, what did he say? He begged, I said simply. He actually begged me to give him some of the money. Please tell me you said no. I said no. Good. That bastard doesn't deserve a penny of your money. I sipped my wine and watched the sun set over my private lake. Kate, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think I'm being too harsh? Too vindictive? Kate was quiet for a moment. Sarah, he gambled away your entire life savings without telling you. He lied to you for months. He made you feel guilty for spending money on groceries while he was blowing hundreds of dollars at casinos. And now he wants you to share lottery winnings that you earned after he'd already destroyed your marriage? When you put it like that, there is no other way to put it, Kate said firmly. You didn't just win the lottery, Sarah. You won your freedom. And you don't owe him a damn thing. She was right, of course. I knew she was right. But there was still a small part of me, the part that had loved David for 8 years, the part that had believed in our future together, that wondered if I was being cruel. Then I remembered the $0 in our savings account. I remembered the grocery money that never came. I remembered the months of lies and the betrayal and the way he'd looked me in the eye while systematically destroying our future, and I stopped feeling guilty. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into building my new life with the same intensity I'd once applied to rebuilding after David's betrayal. I finished furnishing my house, turning it into a home that reflected my tastes and dreams, rather than the compromises of marriage. I started taking art classes, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for when I was working extra hours to make up for David's gambling losses. I also started volunteering at a local women's shelter, working with women who were rebuilding their lives after abusive relationships. Many of them had experienced financial abuse, partners who'd controlled their money, hidden assets, or destroyed their credit. I found that I could help them in ways that went beyond just emotional support. One woman, Maria, reminded me of myself 6 months earlier. Her husband had emptied their bank accounts to fund a drug addiction, leaving her with 2 small children and no resources to escape. The shelter was helping her with legal aid and job training, but she needed clothes for job interviews and money for a security deposit on an apartment. I wrote her a check for $5,000. I can't accept this, she said, staring at the check with tears in her eyes. Yes, you can. I told her, consider it an investment in your future. The money meant nothing to me, literally nothing, given my lottery winnings. But to Maria, it meant the difference between getting back on her feet and staying trapped in poverty. It meant freedom. I started doing more of that, quietly helping women escape financial abuse or rebuild after betrayal. Anonymous donations to legal aid organizations, paying for job training programs, covering security deposits and first month's rent for women starting over. It felt good. Better than any expensive purchase, better than any luxury. Using my unexpected wealth to help other women escape the kind of trap David had tried to create for me felt like the best possible use of my lottery winnings. But I also indulged myself in ways that would have been impossible before. I traveled to Italy and spent 2 weeks touring vineyards and art museums. I bought a sailboat and learned to sail on my private lake. I started collecting art from local artists, filling my house with beauty and creativity. I was living the life I'd always dreamed of but never thought I could afford. The life David's gambling addiction had nearly stolen from me. And through it all, I made sure David knew exactly what he was missing. Not through direct contact, I kept my promise to leave me alone, but through the inevitable social media connections and mutual friends that made it impossible for him to avoid hearing about my new life. When I traveled to Italy, I posted pictures of the Tuscan countryside. When I bought the sailboat, photos of sunset sails on my lake made their way to Facebook. When I started volunteering at the women's shelter, news of my charitable work spread through our old social circle. Each post, each photo, each piece of news was a reminder to David of the life he could have had if he hadn't chosen gambling over our marriage. I never mentioned him directly, never made the connection explicit, but everyone who knew us understood the subtext. This was the life his addiction had cost him. This was what he'd thrown away for the temporary thrill of poker tables and slot machines. I heard through mutual friends that he was struggling with depression on top of his gambling addiction, that he'd started therapy but was having trouble affording it, that he was still living with his friend Mike and taking the bus to work because he couldn't afford to replace the car he'd sold. I felt no sympathy, none whatsoever. The man had systematically lied to me for months, stolen our shared future, and left me to pick up the pieces of our destroyed financial life. If he was depressed now, it was because he was finally facing the consequences of his choices. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I got a call from Mr. Morrison, my divorce lawyer. "Sarah, I wanted to give you a heads up," he said. "David's attorney contacted my office today. He's apparently considering filing an appeal or a post-divorce motion regarding the lottery winnings." My blood went cold. "Can he do that?" "It's complicated," Mr. Morrison said carefully. "The ticket was purchased after the marital breakdown, but before the divorce was finalized. Technically, there might be an argument that lottery winnings during marriage are marital property. But I bought that ticket with my own money, after I'd already discovered his gambling addiction, after I'd already moved out." "I know, and that's our strongest argument. Plus, his financial misconduct and gambling away of marital assets creates a strong case for why he shouldn't be entitled to any portion of your winnings. What do I need to do? Nothing right now. I doubt any lawyer would take his case on contingency given the circumstances, and he can't afford to pay attorney fees up front. But I wanted you to be aware that he might try." After I hung up, I sat in my beautiful kitchen overlooking my private lake and felt the familiar cold anger settle in my chest. Even now, even after everything, David was trying to get his hands on my money. Even after proving he couldn't be trusted with $1, he wanted access to millions. That's when I decided to take my revenge one step further. I called Margaret Whitmore, the real estate agent who'd helped me buy my house. "Margaret, I'm interested in looking at commercial properties," I told her. "Specifically, I want to buy a building in downtown that I can renovate into luxury condos." "That's quite an undertaking," Margaret said. "Did you have a particular property in mind?" "Actually, yes. I want to buy the building where my ex-husband works." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That's interesting. May I ask why?" "Let's call it a business opportunity with personal significance." It took some research, but I eventually identified the building that housed David's telecommunications company. It was an older office building that had seen better days, owned by a company that specialized in commercial real estate investment. With Margaret's help, I made an offer to buy the entire building. The purchase price was $3.2 million, which was honestly pocket change given my lottery winnings. The sellers were happy to deal with a cash buyer who could close quickly and without financing contingencies. Within 30 days, I owned the building where David worked. The plan was simple and elegant. I would renovate the building into high-end condominiums, which was completely legal and economically sound. During the renovation process, all current tenants would need to relocate, including David's company. David would lose his job not because I fired him directly, but because I'd eliminated his workplace. Completely legal, completely justified from a business perspective, and absolutely devastating to a man who was already struggling financially. The beauty of it was that he might never even realize I was behind it. Property ownership records were public, but they were buried in bureaucratic paperwork that most people never bothered to check. To David, it would just look like bad luck, another terrible thing happening to him in a year full of terrible things. But I would know that every day he spent looking for a new job, every day he struggled with unemployment, every day he worried about money was a direct result of his decision to gamble away our marriage. The renovation began 3 months later. I hired the best contractors in the city and spared no expense making the building into something truly spectacular. Each condo would sell for well over $1 million, making the entire project incredibly profitable, even beyond the satisfaction of destroying David's employment. I made sure to drive by the construction site occasionally, watching the workers strip away the old facade and rebuild it into something beautiful and expensive. Something David would never be able to afford, in a building he'd once worked in before his ex-wife bought it out from under him. On the day the eviction notices went out to all the tenants, I happened to be having lunch at a restaurant across the street from the construction site. I watched through the window as David and his co-workers stood on the sidewalk outside their former office building, looking confused and displaced. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, worn down by months of financial stress and the weight of his choices. Part of me, a very small part, felt a flicker of sympathy for him. But then I remembered the $0 in our savings account, and the feeling passed. David's company went out of business within 2 months of losing their office space. Apparently, they'd been struggling financially even before the forced relocation, and the cost of finding new office space was more than they could afford. David was unemployed. I heard about it through Kate, who'd heard it from a mutual friend who'd run into David at the grocery store. He'd been buying ramen noodles and generic cereal, looking like a man who'd hit rock bottom. I almost feel sorry for him, Kate told me over dinner at my house. Almost, I agreed, pouring myself another glass of wine. Do you think he knows you bought his building? I doubt it. And even if he suspects, he can't prove anything. It's a legitimate business investment that happens to be very profitable. You're terrifying when you want to be, you know that? I smiled at my sister across my dining room table, surrounded by the art and beauty and luxury I'd built with my lottery winnings. I learned from the best teacher experience. The condo project was completed 8 months later, and every unit sold within the first month they went on the market. The profit was substantial, even after the renovation costs and real estate fees. I'd turned $3.2 million into $8.7 million, while simultaneously destroying my ex-husband's career. It was the most expensive revenge in history, and it was worth every penny. But I still wasn't done. The final phase of my plan required patience and careful timing. I waited until David had been unemployed for 6 months, until he'd exhausted his meager savings and was probably considering bankruptcy, until he was at his absolute lowest point. Then I made my move. I had my lawyer draw up an offer, not for David directly, but for his creditors, the credit card companies and collection agencies that were undoubtedly hounding him for the money he'd borrowed to fund his gambling addiction. The offer was simple. I would pay off all of David's gambling-related debt in exchange for the creditors agreeing to a specific condition. David would be informed that an anonymous benefactor had paid off his debts, but only on the condition that he never gamble again. If he was ever caught gambling, even a single dollar on a lottery ticket, the full amount of the debt would become due immediately, plus interest and penalties. It cost me $31,000 to pay off David's debts. Again, pocket change compared to my lottery winnings, but it accomplished something beautiful. It gave David just enough relief to survive, while ensuring that his addiction could never again destroy anyone's life the way it had destroyed ours. The creditors were happy to take a lump sum payment rather than chase David for money he clearly didn't have. They agreed to my conditions and sent David a letter explaining that his debts had been paid by an anonymous benefactor under the specified terms. I imagined him reading that letter, probably crying with relief that the collection calls would stop, that his credit wouldn't be completely destroyed, that he had a chance to start over, but also wondering who had helped him and why, and what it meant that his salvation came with the permanent condition that he never gamble again. I never found out how he reacted to the letter because I'd kept my promise to stay out of his life, but I hoped he understood the message. Someone was watching, someone knew about his addiction, and someone had the power to make his life better or worse depending on his choices. A year and a half after our divorce was finalized, I was having dinner at an upscale restaurant when I saw a familiar figure across the room. David was there with a woman I didn't recognize, sharing what looked like a casual dinner date. He looked better than he had during the worst of his unemployment, healthier, less desperate. He'd apparently found a new job, though I doubted it paid as well as his previous position. The woman he was with seemed nice enough, plain, maybe a little older than me, laughing at something he'd said. I watched them for a few minutes, hidden behind my menu, and felt nothing. No anger, no jealousy, no regret. Just a mild curiosity about whether he'd told this new woman about his gambling addiction, whether he'd learned anything from losing everything, whether he ever thought about the $54 million he'd missed out on by choosing poker tables over his marriage. I finished my dinner and left the restaurant without approaching him. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. My revenge was complete, my new life was flourishing, and David was exactly where he deserved to be, starting over with nothing, working to rebuild what his addiction had destroyed, and living with the knowledge that he'd thrown away a fortune because he couldn't control himself. As I drove home to my beautiful house overlooking my private lake, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. 18 months ago, I'd been a married woman planning a future with a man I trusted completely. Now I was a multimillionaire living alone in luxury, having systematically destroyed the life of the man who'd betrayed me. Some people might call what I did cruel. They might say that David was sick, that addiction is a disease, that I should have shown more compassion. But those people had never experienced the particular kind of betrayal that comes from discovering your spouse has been lying to you about money for months. They'd never felt the gut-wrenching shock of finding out their entire financial future had been gambled away without their knowledge or consent. They'd never had to start over from nothing because someone they trusted decided their addiction was more important than their marriage. David had made his choices. He'd chosen to lie, to steal, to gamble away our shared future without giving me a voice in that decision. Every consequence that followed was the direct result of those choices. And I'd made my choices too. I'd chosen to use my unexpected wealth to ensure that David learned exactly what his betrayal had cost him. I'd chosen to build a life so spectacular that he would never be able to forget what he'd thrown away. I'd chosen revenge over forgiveness, justice over mercy, and truth over compassion. And I didn't regret a single decision. 2 years passed in what felt like a dream. My life had settled into rhythms I'd never imagined possible when I was married to David, worrying about grocery money and living paycheck to paycheck. I woke up each morning in my master bedroom overlooking the lake, made coffee in my gourmet kitchen, and chose how to spend my day from an endless array of possibilities. Some mornings I went horseback riding with Luna, who had become not just my horse but my companion and therapy all rolled into one. Other days I worked in my art studio, a converted guest house I'd had built specifically for painting, losing myself in colors and canvases for hours at a time. I'd discovered I had a talent for abstract expressionism, creating pieces that somehow captured the emotional journey from betrayal to freedom. The paintings I created during those first months after the divorce were dark and turbulent, full of sharp angles and deep reds that seemed to bleed across the canvas. But as time passed, my work evolved into something lighter, more hopeful. Sweeping blues and greens that reminded me of the lake outside my window, gentle curves that spoke of peace rather than anger. My art instructor, a woman named Elena who came to my house twice a week, said my paintings told the story of someone finding their way back to themselves. Art doesn't lie. She told me one afternoon as we stood looking at my latest piece, a canvas dominated by brilliant gold sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Your soul is healing, Sarah. I can see it in every brushstroke. She was right, though I hadn't fully realized it myself. The cold, calculating anger that had driven my revenge against David was gradually giving way to something else. Not forgiveness. I wasn't sure I'd ever forgive what he'd done to us, but a kind of peaceful indifference. He was becoming irrelevant to my happiness, which felt like the final and most complete victory of all. My work with the women's shelter had expanded beyond anonymous donations. I'd started teaching financial literacy classes, helping women understand credit scores and banking and investment basics that no one had ever bothered to teach them. Many of these women had been in relationships where their partners controlled all the money, leaving them completely unprepared to manage their own finances when they finally escaped. I never even had my own bank account. One woman named Jennifer told me during a class, "My husband said I didn't need one because he took care of everything. I didn't realize until I left him that I didn't even know how to write a check." Jennifer's story reminded me uncomfortably of my own relationship with David, though in my case it had been more subtle. David hadn't forbidden me from accessing our accounts, but he'd gradually taken over managing our finances in a way that left me less and less informed about our actual financial situation. The end result was the same. When the betrayal came, I was completely unprepared for what I'd discover. Financial independence isn't just about having money, I told my classes. It's about having knowledge and control. It's about never having to trust someone else completely with your security. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was teaching these lessons while sitting on a fortune that had come purely from luck rather than financial savvy. But the lottery win had taught me something important about money. It was a tool, not an end goal. What mattered was what you did with it, how you used it to build the life you actually wanted, rather than the life someone else expected you to want. I'd also started dating again, though cautiously. The first few men I met through friends or at social events were perfectly nice, but I found myself unable to trust their interest in me. Were they attracted to Sarah, the person, or Sarah, the wealthy woman who lived in a mansion and drove a BMW? It was impossible to tell, and the uncertainty made me keep everyone at arm's length. Then I met Michael at, of all places, the women's shelter. He was a volunteer lawyer who helped women with legal aid cases, and he had no idea about my financial situation when we first started talking. To him, I was just another volunteer who came in to teach classes and seemed passionate about helping women rebuild their lives. "You have a good way with them," he said after observing one of my financial literacy sessions. "A lot of people try to help, but they talk down to these women. You talk to them like equals." "They are equals," I said. "They just haven't had the same opportunities to learn." Michael was different from David in every way that mattered. Where David had been charming but ultimately self-centered, Michael was quietly thoughtful. Where David had been secretive about money, Michael was completely transparent. He showed me his salary from the legal aid clinic, his student loan payments, his modest savings account, all without my asking. Where David had hidden his addiction, Michael was open about his own struggles with alcohol in his 20s and his ongoing commitment to sobriety. "I learned that secrets kill relationships," he told me over dinner one evening. "Even the secrets you think you're keeping to protect the other person. Especially those secrets." We'd been seeing each other for 3 months before I told him about the lottery. By then, I was fairly certain he was interested in me rather than my money, but I was still terrified of how the information would change things between us. $54 million, he repeated slowly when I explained why I could afford my house and my lifestyle. "Holy shit, Sarah." We were sitting on my deck watching the sunset over the lake, and I could see him processing the information, trying to reconcile the woman he'd been getting to know with the reality of my wealth. "Does it change things?" I asked quietly. "Between us?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, sipping his beer and staring out at the water. "I'd be lying if I said it doesn't change anything," he said finally. "It explains a lot about why you're so passionate about helping women achieve financial independence. And it makes me understand why you were so cautious about dating. But does it change how you feel about me?" He turned to look at me, his eyes serious. "Sarah, you could be worth 50 cents or $50 billion, and it wouldn't change the fact that you're kind and intelligent and stronger than anyone I've ever met. The money is just money." I wanted to believe him, but I'd learned to be skeptical of promises about money. "It's a lot of money, Michael. It changes everything. Does it change who you are?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, would you be a different person if you'd never won the lottery? Would you still volunteer at the shelter? Would you still care about helping women who've been financially abused? Would you still be passionate about art and horses and building a life that makes you happy?" I thought about it for a moment. "Yes, I think I would." "Then the money didn't change who you are," he said simply. "It just gave you the freedom to be more fully yourself." It was such a simple way of looking at it, but it felt profound. The money hadn't made me into someone different. It had just removed the barriers that had been preventing me from becoming who I was meant to be. Our relationship deepened slowly over the following months. Michael never asked me for money or seemed to expect any kind of financial benefit from dating me. When I offered to pay for expensive dinners or weekend trips, he insisted on splitting costs based on our proportional incomes, which meant he paid what he could afford, and I covered the rest without making him feel like a charity case. "I need to contribute something," he explained when I questioned this arrangement. "I can't be in a relationship where everything is just handed to me. That's not partnership, it's dependence." His pride reminded me of my own insistence on financial independence, even before the lottery. I respected him for it, even when it meant we had to choose less expensive restaurants or simpler vacation destinations than I could easily afford. Meanwhile, my real estate investments had continued to multiply my wealth at a rate that still amazed me. The condo conversion project had been so successful that I'd started looking for other similar opportunities. Margaret Whitmore had become not just my real estate agent, but something like a business partner, helping me identify undervalued commercial properties that could be converted into high-end residential developments. "You have a good eye for this," she told me as we toured a defunct factory building that could potentially become luxury lofts. "Have you ever considered making this your full-time business?" I hadn't, actually. The real estate investments had started as a way to diversify my lottery winnings and make the money last longer, but I was discovering that I genuinely enjoyed the process of seeing potential in abandoned or underutilized buildings and transforming them into something beautiful and valuable. I said, running my hand along the original brick walls of the factory. "I might actually like that." It was around this time that David resurfaced in my life in a way I hadn't expected. Not directly, he'd kept his promise to leave me alone, but through his new girlfriend, the woman I'd seen him with at the restaurant months earlier. Her name was Lisa, and she showed up at one of my financial literacy classes at the women's shelter. She didn't look like someone who belonged there. She was well-dressed, clearly middle class, not the typical demographic of women fleeing abusive relationships or dealing with severe financial hardship. But she sat through my entire class, taking careful notes, and approached me afterward. "Ms. Miller?" she said, using my maiden name, which I'd gone back to after the divorce. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" I was immediately suspicious. There was something familiar about her face, and after a moment I realized where I'd seen her before. "You're David's girlfriend," I said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Lisa Patterson. Could we talk somewhere? Maybe grab coffee?" Every instinct I had screamed at me to refuse. David had sent his girlfriend to approach me, probably hoping to find some way to get money or information or leverage he could use. But I was curious enough about what she wanted that I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near the shelter the following day. Lisa was already waiting when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a large coffee like she was trying to warm herself despite the mild weather. Up close, she looked tired and stressed in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of myself during the worst days of my marriage to David. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as I sat down across from her. "I know this is weird." "That's one word for it," I said. "What do you want, Lisa?" She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for something difficult. "I want to ask you about David's gambling." I felt my entire body tense. "What about it? Was it really as bad as he says it was?" The question caught me completely off guard. "What has he told you?" "He told me that he had a gambling problem during your marriage. That he lost a lot of money and that's why you got divorced. He said he's been going to meetings and hasn't gambled in over 2 years." She paused, staring into her coffee. "But I found something yesterday that makes me think he might be lying." My heart started beating faster. "What did you find?" Lisa pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of what looked like casino chips. These were hidden in his car. When I asked him about them, he said they were old from before we started dating. But they looked new to me. I stared at the photo, feeling the familiar cold anger start to build in my chest. "Lisa, how long have you been dating David?" "About a year." "And when did he tell you about his gambling addiction?" "Last month." She looked up at me with eyes that were pleading for some kind of reassurance. "He said he wanted to be honest with me because things were getting serious between us. He said he'd been in recovery for 2 years and that he'd never gamble again." 2 years. David had supposedly been in recovery for exactly as long as we'd been divorced, which meant he'd probably been gambling throughout his entire relationship with Lisa, just like he'd gambled throughout most of his marriage to me. "Lisa, I said carefully. Has David had money troubles during your relationship? Has he borrowed money from you or had problems paying bills? Her face went pale. How did you know? Because that's exactly what he did to me. I leaned forward across the table. He borrowed money from you, didn't he? Just small amounts at first. 100 here, 50 there. He said his job didn't pay very well and he was still recovering financially from the divorce. She was speaking faster now, the words tumbling out like a confession. But then it was larger amounts. 500 for car repairs, 1,000 for medical bills. I have about $3,000 in credit card debt from lending him money. $3,000. It was a tiny amount compared to what David had stolen from our marriage, but I could see from Lisa's face that it was significant to her, probably more than she could afford to lose. When was the last time he borrowed money from you? I asked. 2 weeks ago. $800 for his rent. She laughed bitterly. I thought I was helping my boyfriend through a rough patch. But if he's gambling again, he never stopped. I said with certainty. Lisa, David is a pathological liar when it comes to money. He will look you in the eye and swear he's changed, swear he's in recovery, swear he'll pay you back, all while he's actively gambling away every dollar he can get his hands on. But the meetings, maybe he goes to meetings, maybe he doesn't. But either way, it's not working. I pulled up my banking app on my phone and showed her the screenshot I'd shown David at the stable months earlier, just enough of my account balance to make a point. This is what I won after our divorce was finalized. This is what David missed out on because he chose gambling over our marriage. Lisa stared at the screen, her mouth falling open. You won the lottery? $54 million. And David has no idea how close he came to being able to gamble away a real fortune instead of just our savings. Oh my God. She looked like she might throw up. He could have been, you could have both been, but we're not. Because David can't control himself around money, and I refuse to enable that anymore. I put my phone away and looked at Lisa seriously. You have a choice to make. You can stay with him and watch him destroy your financial life the same way he destroyed mine, or you can get out now before he takes you down with him. But I love him, she said, and I heard the echo of my own voice from 2 years earlier. I loved him too, I said. But love isn't enough when someone has an addiction they refuse to actually address. And Lisa, if he's hiding casino chips from you and lying about being in recovery, he's not addressing his addiction. He's just getting better at hiding it. She was crying now, quiet tears that dripped into her coffee. What should I do? Protect yourself, I said. Don't lend him any more money. Don't give him access to your credit cards or bank accounts. And seriously consider whether you want to build a future with someone who's already proven he'll lie to you about the most fundamental aspects of your relationship. Did you know? She asked. When you were married to him, did you know he was gambling? Not until the very end. He hid it from me for months. I thought about those final weeks, the anxiety I'd felt about money without understanding why, the way David had become increasingly secretive and irritable. But looking back, there were signs. Money disappearing from our accounts with vague explanations, him being unreachable for hours at a time, mood swings that seemed to correspond with winning or losing streaks. Lisa nodded slowly. He disappears sometimes, says he's working late or helping a friend, but when I call his job or try to reach him, no one knows where he is. That's when he's gambling, I said with certainty. Lisa, you already know the truth. You came to find me because you know something is wrong. Trust your instincts. We sat in silence for a few minutes while Lisa processed what I'd told her. Finally, she looked up at me with a question I'd been dreading. Why did you help him? She asked. I heard that someone paid off his debts after your divorce. Was that you? I'd wondered if David had told Lisa about the anonymous benefactor who'd cleared his gambling debts. I'd hoped he'd kept it to himself, but apparently he'd shared that information too. Why do you think it was me? I asked, deflecting. Because you're the only person he knows with that kind of money, and because you hate him enough to do it with strings attached. She was perceptive. I decided to be honest. Yes, it was me. And you're right about the strings. Why? Because I wanted him to understand that his actions have consequences, and I wanted to make sure he could never hurt anyone else the way he hurt me. I met her eyes across the table. If he gambles even once, those debts become due immediately. It was my insurance policy against him destroying another woman's life. So if those casino chips mean what I think they mean, then David is about to be in serious financial trouble all over again. I felt a familiar coldness settle in my chest. And this time, no one is going to bail him out. Lisa left the coffee shop looking shaken but determined. I gave her my phone number and told her to call me if she needed help extricating herself from David's financial web. Then I went home and poured myself a large glass of wine, trying to process what I'd learned. David was gambling again. Had probably never stopped, despite the meetings and the promises and the supposedly reformed behavior. He was lying to Lisa the same way he'd lied to me, borrowing money to fund his addiction while pretending to be in recovery. And now he was violating the terms of his debt forgiveness, which meant those creditors would soon be coming after him again. Part of me felt vindicated. I'd been right not to trust his claims of recovery, right to protect myself and my lottery winnings from his addiction, right to assume that leopards don't change their spots. David was exactly who I'd thought he was, a pathological liar who would sacrifice any relationship to feed his gambling compulsion. But another part of me felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Not for David exactly, but for Lisa. She was about to go through the same devastating discovery I'd experienced 2 years earlier, the same shock, the same betrayal, the same sickening realization that the person she loved had been systematically lying to her about the most basic aspects of their shared life. I called my lawyer the next morning. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to contact David Hartley's creditors," I said. "I have reason to believe he's violated the terms of his debt forgiveness agreement." "You believe he's gambling again?" "I'm certain of it." I explained about Lisa's discovery of the casino chips and David's continued pattern of borrowing money with vague explanations. "I want those creditors to investigate his recent activity and enforce the penalty clause if they find evidence of gambling." "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" "Once those debts are reinstated, David will likely face bankruptcy. His credit will be destroyed for years." "That's exactly what I want," I said coldly. David made his choice when he decided to gamble again. Now he gets to live with the consequences. Mr. Morrison handled the legal details, and within a week the investigation was complete. David had been gambling regularly for the past 6 months, spending money at 3 different casinos in the area. The creditors immediately reinstated his debts, plus interest and penalties, sending him formal notice that $47,000 was now due within 30 days. I heard about David's reaction through Lisa, who called me in tears 3 days after he received the debt notices. "He's completely lost it," she said, her voice shaking. "He's been calling everyone he knows, trying to borrow money. He even asked me for $20,000 to help with an emergency. Did you give it to him?" "No. After talking to you, I closed my credit cards and moved my savings to a new account he doesn't have access to." Her voice was steadier now. "I also broke up with him." "How did he take that?" "About as well as you'd expect. He accused me of abandoning him when he needs me most. Said I was selfish and cold and that if I really loved him, I'd help him through this crisis." I'd heard variations of that same speech when I'd discovered David's gambling addiction. The guilt, the manipulation, the insistence that love meant enabling his self-destruction. "I'm proud of you for protecting yourself," I told Lisa. "He kept asking who could have told his creditors about the gambling. He's convinced someone is trying to sabotage him." She paused. "I didn't tell him about our conversation." "Good. Let him wonder." But David didn't wonder for long. 2 days later, I came home from my evening ride with Luna to find him sitting in his car in my driveway. My blood ran cold when I saw him there, partly from anger and partly from a flicker of genuine fear. David had never been violent during our marriage, but I'd heard enough stories about desperate people doing unpredictable things when they felt cornered. I considered calling the police, but curiosity won out over caution. I parked my BMW in the garage and walked over to his car, staying far enough back that I could run if necessary. "David," I said through his open window, "you need to leave." "Did you do it?" he asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Did you tell them I was gambling?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Bullshit, Sarah. Someone investigated my finances and found out about the casinos. Someone with enough money and connections to make my creditors care about enforcing some clause I didn't even know existed." He got out of the car and faced me across my pristine driveway. "There's only one person I know with that kind of resources and that much hatred for me. If your creditors are coming after you, it's because you violated the terms of your debt forgiveness," I said calmly. "That's nobody's fault but your own. You did this." His voice was getting louder, more agitated. "You've been planning this for 2 years, haven't you? Waiting for me to slip up so you could destroy me all over again." "I didn't make you gamble, David. I didn't make you lie to Lisa. I didn't make you violate the agreement that kept you out of bankruptcy." I took a step back toward my house. "All I did was make sure there were consequences for your choices." "Consequences?" He laughed, but it was an ugly sound. Sarah, I'm about to lose everything. My apartment, my car, probably my job when they garnish my wages. I'm going to be homeless because of you. You're going to be homeless because you're a gambling addict who refuses to actually get help. I corrected. How many meetings did you actually attend, David? How many times did you lie to Lisa about where you were and what you were doing? How much of her money did you steal to fund your addiction? His face flushed red. I never stole from Lisa. Borrowing money under false pretenses is stealing. Taking money for car repairs and medical bills when you're actually spending it at casinos is stealing. I felt the familiar cold anger building in my chest. It's the same thing you did to me, except Lisa was smart enough to get out before you destroyed her entire financial life. I loved you, he said, and his voice cracked slightly. I loved you more than anything, and you destroyed me because of a mistake. A mistake? I stared at him in disbelief. David, you didn't make a mistake. You made hundreds of deliberate choices to lie to me, to steal from our joint accounts, to gamble away our future without my knowledge or consent. That wasn't a mistake, it was a betrayal. And the lottery money? His voice was getting desperate now. $54 million that should have been ours, that could have solved all our problems, and you kept it secret out of spite. I kept it secret because you proved you couldn't be trusted with money, I said. Because if I'd told you about those winnings, you would have found a way to gamble them away just like you gambled away everything else we had. You don't know that, don't I? I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshot Lisa had shared with me, the photo of the casino chips she'd found in his car. You've been gambling for months while telling everyone you were in recovery. You borrowed money from your girlfriend to fund your addiction while claiming you were financially responsible now. You haven't changed at all, David. You've just gotten better at lying. He stared at the photo on my phone, and I watched the last of his defiance crumble. How did you get that? Lisa came to see me. She wanted to know if you were really as bad as you'd told her, or if you were lying about being in recovery. I put my phone away. Turns out you were lying about being in recovery, but you weren't lying about being bad. If anything, you undersold it. She broke up with me, he said quietly. Good for her. We stood there in my driveway as the sun set behind my beautiful house, and I felt a strange sense of closure. This was it. This was the end of whatever connection had remained between us. David had gambled away his second chance just like he'd gambled away his first, and now he was going to face the consequences without any safety net. I'll be homeless, he said again, as if repetition might somehow change the reality of his situation. There are resources available, I said. Shelters, assistance programs, job training. You'll survive. Will I? He looked up at my house, taking in the expensive architecture and perfectly maintained grounds. Will I survive watching my ex-wife live in luxury while I lose everything because of an addiction I can't control? That's not my problem anymore, David. It stopped being my problem the day I found out you'd been lying to me for months. I started walking toward my front door. You need to leave now, and don't come back. Sarah, wait. There was something in his voice that made me turn around. Could you help me? Just enough to get an apartment? Maybe pay off some of the debt so I'm not completely destroyed? I stared at him for a moment. This man who had shared my bed for 8 years, who had promised to love and honor me, who had systematically betrayed that promise for his addiction. No, I said simply. Please. I'm begging you. You begged me before, when I first found out about your gambling. You promised you'd change, promised you'd get help, promised you'd never gamble again. I shook my head. And 6 months later, you were stealing money from your girlfriend to feed the same addiction. Why would this time be any different? Because I've lost everything now. I understand what the addiction cost me. You understood what it cost you 2 years ago when you lost our marriage and our savings. That didn't stop you from gambling again. I reached for my front door handle. Goodbye, David. I hope you get the help you actually need, but that help isn't going to come from me. I went inside and locked the door behind me, then watched through my window as David sat in his car for another 20 minutes before finally driving away. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my deck, trying to process the strange mix of emotions I was feeling. Relief, certainly. David was finally completely out of my life. There would be no more surprise visits, no more attempts to guilt me into helping him, no more reminders of the marriage he'd destroyed with his addiction. Satisfaction, too. My revenge was complete in a way I'd never originally planned. David hadn't just lost his marriage and his savings. He'd lost his second chance, his new relationship, and his ability to start fresh. He was going to face the consequences of his addiction without any support system, just as he deserved. But underneath those feelings was something I hadn't expected, a kind of profound sadness. Not for David exactly, but for the waste of it all. For the man he could have been if he'd gotten real help instead of just learning to lie better. For the life we could have built together if he'd been honest about his struggles instead of trying to handle them alone. For the 8 years of marriage that had ended not because we'd grown apart or fallen out of love, but because one person's addiction had poisoned everything we'd built together. Michael found me on the deck an hour later, still nursing my wine and watching the stars reflect on the lake. "Rough day?" he asked, settling into the chair next to mine. I'd called him earlier to let him know about David's visit, partly for safety reasons, and partly because I needed someone to know where I was in case the situation escalated. "He's really gone now," I said. "Finally, completely gone. How do you feel about that?" "Relieved. Sad. Angry. Satisfied." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. "All of the above." "That's normal," Michael said. "The end of any significant relationship is complicated, even when that relationship was destructive." "I destroyed him," I said quietly. "Systematically, deliberately destroyed him." "Did you make him gamble again?" "No." "Did you make him lie to Lisa?" "No." "Did you force him to violate the terms of his debt forgiveness?" "No." I opened my eyes and looked at Michael. "But I set up the circumstances that made his destruction inevitable when he failed to control his addiction." "Which you did because he'd already proven he couldn't control his addiction and had used it to destroy your financial life," Michael pointed out. "Sarah, you didn't destroy David. His gambling addiction destroyed David. You just made sure it couldn't destroy you too." He was right, of course. But there was something about the calculated nature of my revenge that still bothered me. The lottery win had given me power I'd never expected to have, and I'd used that power to ensure David paid the highest possible price for his betrayal. It had been effective, it had been satisfying, and it had been completely legal. But it had also been ruthless in a way that sometimes kept me awake at night. "Do you think I'm a bad person?" I asked Michael. "I think you're a person who was deeply hurt and betrayed, who used the resources available to you to protect yourself and ensure justice was served," he said. "I think David made his own choices and you made sure those choices had real consequences. And I think the world is probably better off with one less person thinking they can lie and steal and manipulate their way through life without facing any accountability." Over the following months, I heard occasional updates about David through mutual acquaintances. He'd declared bankruptcy, lost his apartment, and was staying in a series of temporary housing situations. He'd found a new job, but it paid significantly less than his previous position, and most of his wages were being garnished to pay off creditors. He'd also apparently finally started attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings regularly, not the sporadic attendance he'd claimed during his relationship with Lisa, but actual, consistent participation in a recovery program. Whether this was genuine change or just another attempt to convince people he was reformed remained to be seen, but at least he was no longer in a position to financially abuse another partner. I felt no guilt about his situation. David was experiencing the natural consequences of his choices, consequences he'd managed to avoid for years through lies and manipulation, and the generosity of people who believed his promises to change. If he was finally getting real help for his addiction, that was good. If he was just going through the motions to try to rebuild his reputation, that was his choice too. My own life continued to flourish in ways I'd never imagined possible. My real estate investments had grown into a legitimate business empire, with Margaret and I partnering on increasingly ambitious projects. We'd converted a dozen buildings into high-end residential properties, earning millions in profits while revitalizing neglected areas of the city. "You have a gift for this," Margaret told me as we celebrated the completion of our latest project, a converted warehouse that had sold out within days of going on the market. "Have you thought about expanding into other cities?" I had, actually. The success of my local investments had given me confidence that I could replicate the formula elsewhere. I'd been researching markets in neighboring states, looking for cities with the right combination of historic architecture and growing populations that made conversion projects profitable. But more than the business success, I was proud of what I'd built personally. My relationship with Michael had deepened into something stable and honest, based on genuine compatibility rather than financial necessity or desperation. My volunteer work at the women's shelter had expanded into consulting with other organizations, helping them develop financial literacy programs that actually met women's needs. And my art had evolved into something I was genuinely proud of. Elena had convinced me to enter several pieces in local gallery shows, and to my amazement, they'd sold. Not because people knew I was wealthy and wanted to curry favor, but because my paintings actually moved them emotionally. "Your work has a rawness to it that's very compelling," one gallery owner told me. "There's pain in these pieces, but also hope. It's the journey of someone who's been through something difficult and come out stronger." She wasn't wrong. My art was my emotional autobiography, charting the path from betrayal to healing, to the discovery of who I really was when I wasn't trying to be what someone else needed me to be. The early pieces were dark and angry, full of sharp edges and bleeding colors. But the recent work was different, still complex and emotionally honest, but infused with light and possibility. 3 years after my divorce from David, I was a completely different person than I'd been during our marriage. Wealthier, obviously, but also stronger, more confident, more independent. I'd learned that I didn't need anyone else to validate my worth or manage my life or tell me what was possible for my future. The lottery money had given me freedom, but I'd learned to use that freedom to become the person I was meant to be. And David? David was exactly where he'd put himself through his own choices. Struggling financially, socially isolated, dealing with the long-term consequences of his addiction and the lies he'd told to cover it up. I felt no sympathy for him, but I also no longer felt the burning need for revenge that had driven me in the months after our divorce. Justice had been served. The scales had been balanced. David had learned what it felt like to lose everything, and I had learned what it felt like to build everything from scratch according to my own vision rather than someone else's expectations. Sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep, I would think about the strange chain of events that had brought me to this point. If David hadn't gambled away our savings, I never would have been at that gas station feeling desperate enough to buy a lottery ticket. If I hadn't won the lottery, I never would have had the resources to ensure David faced real consequences for his addiction. If David hadn't betrayed me so completely, I never would have discovered my own capacity for both ruthlessness and rebuilding. In a twisted way, David's addiction had been the catalyst for everything good in my current life. His betrayal had forced me to find strength I didn't know I had. His lies had taught me the value of absolute honesty. His financial irresponsibility had made me appreciate my own competence with money. And his inability to change had shown me exactly how much I was capable of changing when I put my mind to it. The lottery ticket I'd bought in desperation had given me $54 million. But the real prize hadn't been the money. It had been the discovery that I didn't need anyone else's approval or support or love to build a life worth living. I'd learned that justice and healing and success were things I could create for myself, with my own hands and my own choices and my own determination. David had taken 8 years of my life and nearly destroyed my financial future. But in the end, he'd also given me something invaluable. The knowledge that I was strong enough to survive anything and smart enough to turn even the worst betrayal into the foundation for something better. I was sitting on my deck one evening, painting the sunset over my lake, when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it. "Sarah?" The voice was hesitant, unfamiliar. "This is Tom Bradley. I was David's sponsor in Gamblers Anonymous." My brush froze halfway to the canvas. "Was?" "David died yesterday," Tom said gently. "Heart attack. He asked me to call you if anything happened to him." I set down my brush with hands that were suddenly unsteady. "He's dead?" The doctor said it was likely stress-related. His heart just couldn't handle the pressure anymore. Tom paused. "Sarah, I know things ended badly between you two, but David talked about you a lot in meetings. He understood that he'd destroyed your marriage, and he was genuinely sorry for what he'd put you through." I closed my eyes and tried to process what I was hearing. David was dead. The man who had shared my bed for 8 years, who had promised to love me forever, who had systematically betrayed that promise, was gone. At 53 years old, probably brought down by the stress of facing the consequences of his addiction. Was he? I struggled to find the right words. Was he actually in recovery this time? "He was trying," Tom said. He'd been coming to meetings regularly for about a year, working the program, trying to make amends for the damage he'd caused. It wasn't easy for him, facing up to what his addiction had cost him and the people he'd hurt. Did he? I took a breath. Did he ever take responsibility for what he did to our marriage? He did. In fact, he wanted me to tell you something if anything happened to him. Tom's voice was quiet, careful. He said to tell you that you were right to leave him and right to protect yourself from his addiction. He said he hoped you were happy and that he was sorry he'd ever made you doubt that you deserved to be. I hung up the phone and sat staring at my half-finished painting, trying to understand what I was feeling. Relief that David could never hurt me or anyone else again. Sadness for the waste of a life that could have been different if he'd gotten real help earlier. And something else, a kind of closure I hadn't expected to find. David was dead, and with him died the last connection to the woman I'd been during our marriage. The woman who'd worried about grocery money and trusted her husband to manage their finances and believed that love was enough to overcome any problem. That woman was as gone as David was, replaced by someone stronger and wiser and more capable of protecting herself. I picked up my brush and added a few more strokes to my painting. A sunset that was both ending and beginning, darkness and light existing in the same sky. It was beautiful and complex and honest about the reality that most things in life were neither completely good nor completely evil, but something more nuanced and difficult to categorize. Michael found me there an hour later, still painting in the gathering darkness. David died, I told him without looking up from my canvas. How do you feel about that? It was the same question he'd asked after David's final visit to my house, and I gave him the same answer. All of the above. We sat together in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky. David was gone, truly and finally gone, and I was still here. Still building, still growing, still becoming more fully myself with each passing day. The revenge was complete, but more importantly, so was my healing. The lottery ticket I'd bought in desperation had given me the resources to ensure justice was served. But the real victory wasn't that David had faced consequences for his actions. It was that I'd learned to build a life so fulfilling that his presence or absence no longer mattered to my happiness. I was free, not just financially but emotionally. Free from the need for revenge, free from the weight of old anger, free to focus entirely on the future I was still creating for myself. And that future was bright with possibility.